Hello, everyone, and greetings to your excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our pop stars, and the youth. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you today. I know we are running a little over time, and as a lot of the points that I wanted to make have already been made by the excellent speakers before me, I will restrict my intervention to mentioning two studies that I think have great importance in the discussions that we're having here today. So one of these is actually a study that was done by colleagues of mine that I was also involved in at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And what this study was really trying to do was really to understand how vulnerabilities vary across the globe, not only to potential exposure of global risks, but also to understand how multiple risks are overlaid and how hotspots emerge that are areas where these multiple risks exist. So in this particular study, what we really tried to understand was not only the severity of climate change and the hazards that emerge from that, but also what is the spatial distribution of populations, how this will change over time, and what is vulnerability and capacity to prepare and manage risks. So in this particular study, we looked at indicators related to energy risks, land risks, and water risks. And we looked at this over a period of the next century, focusing really for up to the middle of the century, that is up to 2050. And what we concluded from this was that although the global exposure to multiple risks in terms of global land area, will be a very small fraction. But in fact, the risks to human populations will be very large, because much of this global area that is hotspots of multiple risks occur in coastal areas and other areas of high population density. So in fact, areas where you will see increased heat stress, water stress, and variability up to 2050 will be these coastal areas and areas of high population density where hotspots will emerge. And what we also realized is in the process of this research that in fact, the risks, the population that are exposed to these risks will double between an end of the century temperature rise of 2 degrees as opposed to 1.5 degrees. So in other words, if we were to restrict temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, we can really halve the population dependent on or exposed to these multiple risks. So this is an extremely important thing, because we also found that, of course, these areas are not equitably distributed over the globe. In fact, Asian regions and African regions and coastal Asian and African regions in particular will be areas where over 75% of the population could be living in these areas of multiple risks. So the whole equity dimension of the changes that we're looking for are extremely important in any of the management that we think about as we go forward. The only other point I'd like to make is related to another very important report of the Ocean Panel that was mentioned already, that came out last year. So this particular report of the Ocean Panel, this high-level panel for the oceans, was on looking at possible oceans-related mitigation options. We've talked a lot about what we are doing wrong. We've talked a lot about potential impacts for the economy of these ocean-related changes that we're observing. But there are also very important mitigation options that the oceans afford us. And this particular report highlighted 6 such mitigation options that can have a significant dent in reducing our emissions as we go forward. And I just briefly talk about these 6 options. So the biggest one is really ocean-based renewable energy. So in fact, there's a huge potential to use the oceans in both things like wind, offshore wind, tidal energy, and other such options that can really help to reduce emissions in the future. Uh, and in addition, there is the issue of ocean-based transport, which we've heard about from several of the speakers today. Decarbonizing our ocean freight transport and passenger transport can be another important way of mitigating emissions that are ocean related in some way. Coastal and marine ecosystems are another way of really improving emissions, reducing emissions by really reducing our salty marshes, restoring mangroves, sea grass beds, and seaweeds. Fisheries and aquaculture are another important area, shifting diets away from land-based meat to fisheries and having sustainable fisheries and mariculture can be a very important way also of meeting the growing food demand for protein in particular and reducing emissions at the same time. Finally, the final mitigation option that was highlighted by this particular study was the issue of carbon storage in the seabed. Of course, this is an area where we don't have much experience yet, where a lot of investment and research is still required, and also understanding the impacts of this is still very, very important. However, these options provide a huge potential for us to reduce up to 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per annum by 2030, and more than 2.5 times that by 2050. So in fact, these options together could reduce our emissions gap by more than 20% by the middle of the century if we were to implement these smartly. I really would not like to take more of your time now because I know it's very late in different parts of the world where you're joining from. But I think we need to remember these very important options the oceans afford us to also reduce emissions in addition to improving the equity in the vulnerability of people and reducing impacts to ocean-related changes, climate changes. Thank you very much.